Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my underground lair. I have gathered here before me the world's deadliest assassins, and yet each of you has failed to kill Austin Powers.
Alright, so you might be wondering why we used Austin Powers as the theme for this video, and it's because I'm filming these, as I think I told you, in my basement. So I'm down here working on this stuff by myself, and every time my wife comes in, I always say, "Welcome to my underground lair." And so I thought, that would be a good place to film from. So we're going to do this episode from within the Dr. Evil's underground lair. So before we get started, this is the first video in the sequence for chapter 8. And so what I did was I split this up into 6 parts that track the main sections of the chapter, with one exception, and that's part 4. It's really long, deals with patents, and so I decided to break that up into an A and a B. So we'll have 7 videos. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, 4A, 4B, and then 5, and then 6. So I will do my best to keep these videos in a short, watchable length. That's what I've been trying to do. But sometimes the content is just a little bit more detailed. So before we get started, this is the first video in the sequence for chapter 8. And so what I did was I split this up into 6 parts that track the main sections of the chapter, with one exception, and that's part 4. It's really long, deals with patents, and so I decided to break that up into an A and a B. So we'll have 7 videos. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, 4A, 4B, and then 5, and then 6. So I will do my best to keep these videos in a short, watchable length. That's what I've been trying to do. But sometimes the content is just a little bit more detailed. So our quote for this chapter is, I think, kind of interesting, because it says that the only real monopoly is the United States patent. And I think that the reason for this is because a United States patent is protected by U.S. law. It's basically a legally granted license, almost like a franchise, to have the exclusive use of an invention for a limited period of time. And as we'll see in this chapter, something that's very interesting about the way that patent law and antitrust law interact is that patent law is superior to antitrust law. The Supreme Court concluded this. So what that means is if that you are exercising rights under a patent, you are essentially free from antitrust law. Now there are exceptions to that, and we will see this play out throughout the chapter. But antitrust acts as a limiter on some of the behavior that these companies engage in. So we will see that, and we will also see the limits of patents. So we have this idea that you invent something, you file the patent, and that then, great, you get to make money off of it. Well, we'll see in this chapter that patents by themselves aren't really worth that much unless the patent holder has the resources to defend them, and that potential infringers sometimes will only respect a patent that actually has been litigated and protected. So there are limits on the value of patents. So we are here looking at our Porter's 5 forces again, and for this chapter, for chapter 8, we are looking at the threat of substitutes. So these are threats coming from other industries, or from industries that don't exist yet, as opposed to last chapter when we talked about new entrants to the same industry. This chapter deals with substitute products that could substitute for the incumbent product and take market share away from the incumbent, or in some cases just knock the incumbent out. That's the fear that incumbents have when a substitute comes into the market. And we're going to see all the different ways, some very shady, that these incumbents use to try to block markets. We also see shady tactics for large companies trying to come in and enter new markets that they're not in and try to crush innovators that have started new markets that are related or that they can compete in. So the chapter starts off with two stories that I thought would be fun to take a minute and talk about. The first is Tiberius. I looked him up, second Roman emperor. He ruled from 14 AD to 37 AD. This whole story about killing the inventor of the indestructible glass is thought to be more of a rumor than a true story, but I think the guy was pretty brutal, so I don't think that part of it is unbelievable. But it does make the point that if this product were to be released to the general public, it might make other things like precious metals worth less money. That was what Tiberius was concerned about, and that's exactly what our incumbents in all these stories we're going to be talking about in this chapter are concerned about too. They're concerned that this new product is going to come in and make the assets that they have worth less money. And that is why they engage in blocking strategies as aggressively as they do. The other story is a movie called The Man in the White Suit. And after I read this book the first time, I watched it. You can rent it on YouTube for a couple of bucks. It's an old black and white movie. And those are fun to watch sometimes. I like watching those old movies. My wife and I every so often go through a phase where we watch these old movies. But it's actually the trailer of it is interesting because you see the dynamics that we are talking about in this chapter right here in this part of the clip. So why don't you take a look? Right, so you see in this case the man in the white suit who has his product. The incumbents, the rich old men, are telling him that they'll pay him twice as much to keep his product off the market. But of course he's an idealist and he thinks his product is going to save the world and doesn't want to get paid a lot to keep what he thinks is a society-changing product off the market. So it's an enjoyable movie. It's worth watching. Okay, so there are threats and strategies that are associated with patents. So, or actually not just patents, but I mean that's the tech context that we're going to be talking about, but the threat of substitutes. So these are threats coming from outside the industry. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. And the greatest threat is when the core business model is threatened. And when a substitute is going to threat the core business model, that's when the incumbents tend to get very, very aggressive. And Shell makes this point that when a competitor is surrounded by close substitutes, by a lot of close substitutes, that this is equal, the same competitive pressure, it's an equivalent competitive pressure to the new entrant. And that's why we see in Porter's Five Forces, we see coming from the two sides, we see the threat of substitutes and the threat of new entrants. And the point here is that that threat is roughly equal. Those new entrants coming in to compete in the same market, or substitutes making the incumbent's product less valuable. And we'll see some stories too, and we hear plenty of stories where the incumbent doesn't realize that their core business is under assault, and they sometimes don't then react because they don't recognize the threat. And we see examples of this in a lot of technological cases. We saw it in photography, digital photography. There's a story we're going to look at. Kodak is actually one of our stories in this chapter, but they completely missed the digital camera revolution. In fact, they created the first digital camera and then were ultimately crushed by it because they didn't recognize or understand the threat that it posed. Okay, so how do you deal with this? What are the different ways that you contain these competitors coming from substitutes? And there's a couple of different versions you'll see as we look through some of the stories in the chapter and some other stories that I have looked up. One is to just block and delay the development of the new substitute. Sometimes that's enough. If you can buy enough time to get a competitive product or to take other evasive maneuvers, sometimes that's enough. So some strategies are just involved with blocking or delaying. But then there's also these mammoth fights to the finish, these just epic battles among competitors over substitute products. And we'll see many examples in this chapter of competitors who have gone bankrupt as a result of the blocking strategies or the strategies of the other firms. So we see many examples of that in this chapter. So this is life or death stuff here. Okay, so if you've taken an econ class, you're familiar with the idea of elasticity. And you usually talk about it, as I recall, it's been a long time since I've been in an econ class, but you normally think about it as it normally comes up in price elasticity. And what that means is that it's a measurement of how likely a purchaser or consumer is to switch the product based, in the case of price elasticity, on a change in price. But here, we're talking about substitute elasticity. So how likely is a customer to switch from one product to another? The more likely they are, the more elastic the demand is, the more changeable. And the term elastic refers to, an elastic waistband, moving and changing. Whereas if they're not likely to change based on what a substitute looks like, then demand is relatively inelastic. And one example that I'm not even going to try to explain this chart to you that's here on the slide. I just put it there as more of just a graphical representation. Somebody, of course, some economist has mapped all of this out. But I think about the iPhone. So I have an iPhone. I don't have it in my pocket right at the moment, but I have an iPhone. And I've waited a long time. I have a 6S, believe it or not. And it's kind of on its last leg. The speaker doesn't work. I've had the battery replaced a couple times. But it's getting to the point where it needs a replacement. And I'm going to replace it with the 12, which is supposed to come out this year in the fall of 2020, although that's now delayed from what I hear. But it doesn't matter to me how good of an Android phone is available. It really doesn't matter. I don't pay any attention to it. I have no interest in buying an Android, and so I'm waiting for the iPhone 12 to come out no matter what. I am completely inelastic to my demand for the iPhone 12 is completely inelastic. I will not switch products no matter how good the Android phone is. And that's in parts has to do with something we call a network effect, which we'll talk about later. It also has to do with consumer preferences and that sort of thing. So Apple, the iPhone, is a little bit less inelastic to the threat of a substitute just because of, there's a variety of reasons why that is, which we don't have time to talk about now, but it has to do with consumer preference. So that would be something interesting to talk about in the forums if you want to. How inelastic is your demand for either your iPhone or your Android? That'd be interesting to know. I know it's two camps on that. All right, so another story which I know I've told in a previous video, but I'm going to bring it up again here, is that some of these battles depend on how the market ultimately is defined. And so one of the ways to think about this is how you define, and this comes up mostly in the antitrust context. So let me say that when companies are looking to maximize their control of a certain market, they have to worry that they're going to be get in trouble for antitrust. And I told the story before about Office Max and Office Depot, how the regulators defined the market as the market for office superstores. But ultimately that was not the proper market definition, or at least maybe at the time it was, but shortly thereafter, it was pretty clear that consumers weren't just buying office supplies at office superstores. They were buying them in other places. And so the combination of Office Max and Office Depot ultimately was somewhat necessary in order for those two companies to compete in the market. There wasn't enough space for Staples, Office Depot, and Office Max, and Costco, and Walmart, and Target, and all the other places that people get their, and Amazon, all the other places people get their office supplies from. Now, this picture is, I don't know about you, but it's super creepy, but this is an actual real ad for cellophane, and I don't think you would ever want to actually do this, so I hope they didn't actually do this for the picture, but cellophane's another example from the book. Did the company control the market for cellophane? Yes. Did they? But was cellophane or cellophane substitutes or competitors, were cellophane competitors the only market? The answer there, they argued successfully, was no. That the market was all products that you would use to wrap foods and other things you use cellophane for. So there's wax paper and there's other different ways that you do that. So they were successful in convincing the court that the market was for wrapping products, not for cellophane. And that's how they survived an antitrust concern. Okay, so the rest of the videos are going to cover the main subheaders in the chapter. So part 2 will cover new product introductions. Part 3 are new methods of distribution. Part 4 is the big one. That's so much content in that section that I broke it into 2 parts. The first part deals with patents in general, how patents work and how they're used, and how they work, and sort of introductory material. And then the second video, the part 4B, is going to look at the 4 strategies for patents that Shell discusses in the book. And then we'll go to the establishment of new technical standards. We've seen some of this already. This has a lot to do with lobbying and control of standards that are used, that are adopted for given products or given markets. And then lastly, we will do our normal quick review of the 5 factors. Okay, what questions do you have? What do you think about some of these strategies in the book? How elastic or inelastic is your demand for your phone or any other product? I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts and your comments. Thank you for being so good at and active in the forums. I really appreciate all of the effort that you have made, and hopefully we have another good discussion this week. So thanks for watching this, and we'll see you in part 2. Thanks.
Now, Mr. Evil.
Dr. Evil. I didn't spend 6 years in evil medical school to be called Mr. Thank you very much.